Hello, everyone. This is Adam Tabera with Psychedelic Insights. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful day today. In today's episode, me and my colleague Jake Slomowitz will be interviewing Elemer Piros, one of the senior biotechnology analysts at EF Hutton, and he also has a PhD in neuroscience. I think getting Elemer's perspective on the psychedelic sector at large can provide a lot of value to the audience and to the viewers on this channel. He is independent, so he's not affiliated with any of these biotech companies. And just to get his expert perspective on the sector in general, I think is really important if you're just speculating on the sector like all of us are. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview as much as I enjoyed being a part of it, and let's get the show on the road.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psychedelic Insights. Today I have the original creator of this channel, Adam Tabera, with me and my colleague. And we have the master of due diligence in the psychedelic biotech space here with us today, senior biotechnology equity analyst at EF Hutton, Elemer Piros. Welcome, Mr. Piros.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jake. We could be on a first name basis, Elemer.
Oh, awesome. All right. So, Elemer, I reached out to you because I really would love to hear your thoughts on the 5-MeO and NN-DMT drug development space specifically. In the retail investment community, on Shroomstock's Reddit, for example, you don't see that many people talk about this company, GH Research. They have the largest market cap in the sector. They have a cash runway into 2026. I was extremely impressed with their phase 1/2A trial, even though it was very small. Seeing minus 24.4 reduction on the MADRS at day 7 and 7 out of 8 patients with TRD in remission. And there was no psychological support either in this trial. We'd just love to hear what you're looking at with GH Research nowadays.
Yeah, so GH Research is one of those underfollowed companies. Obviously, they have a very comfortable cash position. They are moving into advanced studies with their 5-MeO DMT drug. And, both 5-MeO DMT and DMT are very rapid acting and very short duration drugs. So the trip could be over and done within 15 minutes, or in some cases may last a little shorter or a little longer. What distinguishes the 5-MeO DMT from DMT is that there are no visual effects. So it's essentially you're blown away.
Yeah.
Right after inhalation, you lose any control of your mind. You are completely detached from anything that is normal, otherwise, including your ego. And 15 minutes later, you gently land and you're back to normal. DMT is slightly different with extreme visual effects, especially at higher doses, which some people describe as more real than real life.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that both of these medicines have the capability of resetting the brain in a very quick, very aggressive manner. In 15 minutes, you get a complete reset. And this is the thought process that goes into using these medicines to treat conditions when there is a circuitry, let it be in depression, anxiety, trauma, or addiction, in which somebody's stuck. And this program just keeps on running and running every single day. And you can disrupt it with some medication to some people and make it more normal, but never completely normal. But the power of psychedelics is that they can actually essentially reset this circuitry and allow, with neuroplasticity, to essentially rewire the brain. Now, imagine how unbelievable this sounds, this reset in 15 minutes, when you had a condition that lasted for decades. and
Yeah.
you try to treat it with various medications, and you're still treatment resistant. Treatment resistant meaning that you're terminally in this condition, whether for the next 2 years or for the next 40 years. And according to the research that was put out by GH Research, and you recited the results, immediately there is a relief that lasts, in this case, up to 7 days. We don't know how long because they didn't absorb beyond the 7 days. But another company that we might bring into the picture, which develops DMT, a very visual compound, um, have actually 6 months data that a 1 or 2 administration of the drug, again, 15 to 30-minute experience, causes remission, immediate remission in 40% of the patients. Again, that study is small as well, but it is controlled. They had a placebo control. So it's the value of that information is probably a little bit more than what GH Research has so far with the single arm study when they treated 8 patients, 7 of 8, which went into remission. And whether it's a small trial or a larger trial, these numbers are unheard of in psychiatry.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
very promising.
sorry to interrupt. Have you ever seen, even in a small study, I've been following some of these trials in mental health for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. Have you ever seen minus 24.4 points on the MADRS in any other trial?
That's completely unheard of. Now, the only thing that we have to be cognizant about is that we need to always compare it to control.
Yes.
So if we had a placebo control, because these 8 patients could have been selected by random to be likely responders, likely dramatic responders. But once you have a control group and you see a difference of 3 points, 5 points, a dozen points between treated and placebo, that's the measure that people usually rely on, is what is the benefit over on top of the placebo. Because as you can imagine, if you jolt the brain, whether it's with electric shock or with a drug like 5-MeO-DMT, there is going to be some residual halo effect that, oh my gosh, my head is completely clear. This halo effect usually don't last. So in the case of the DMT trial by Small Pharma, 40% of the people experienced remission 6 months after dosing. So this is what is unprecedented, and not only the magnitude of the change or the benefit, but the onset, which is immediate. With an antidepressant, we have to wait for weeks to figure out that it works or it doesn't work. So, and you continue to suffer during these initial periods.
Just want to chime in with a question real quick. So, from the small pharma study, were they going for like breakthrough experiences with the DMT, or like do we know more about kind of the psychedelic space they were getting their patients into?
So in their phase 1 trial, which was conducted in healthy volunteers, they figured out the dose that would put the vast majority of individuals into the maximum so-called peak experience zone. And there are questionnaires for that. Sometimes it's debatable whether a person who is not an experienced user, when they say on a 0 to 10 scale that, oh, this was a 9, it's probably very relative of what is a 9 for someone or what is a 6, since they don't have a reference to compare it to. But what was interesting about the healthy volunteer data, that the error bars around this maximal number were very tight, meaning the variability was very little. So most people identified their experience in this peak region. And what GH research did or does, even in their upcoming phase 2b trial, they titrate people, meaning they repeat the dose until you get into this peak band,
Yes.
maximal psychedelic experience.
To reap the maximum therapeutic benefit from, let's say, 5-MeO DMT or NN-DMT, is it safe to say that you would need to reach those peak dosages or those breakthrough experiences to really maximize the therapeutic benefits?
So the evidence is still being generated on that, meaning does the intensity correlate with the clinical benefit, meaning higher intensity, more clinical benefit. We have some partial data from Compass Pathways, which did a psilocybin experiment with 1 milligram, 10 milligram, and 25 milligram dose. And we've seen that the higher dose leads to a higher clinical benefit or more significant improvement on the MADRS scale that Jake cited earlier.
So, Elemer, back to just to 5-MeO for a second here. So, like you said, with these drugs, it's incredible how, for when it works for people, it's immediate.
Yeah.
I think the only drug I'm aware of that is rapid acting right now, but it's for major depressive disorder, is this drug Auvelity from Axum Therapeutics. It's an NMDA antagonist. I don't think it has dissociative or minimal dissociative effects, but yeah, what we're seeing with and in the early data from 5-MeO, and more from NN-DMT from small pharma, but we'll stick with 5-MeO here. So, sorry, getting a little off topic. What I'm trying to get at here is with this question. So, GH Research is doing this without any psychological support. People say that 5-MeO is one of the most intense psychedelics. Like, I've heard many people say there's nothing that compares to a breakthrough experience on 5-MeO. How is GH Research, like, how do you feel? So Beckley Psytech is also working with 5-MeO, but they have psychological support. They even are looking at alcohol use disorder with abstinence-based psychotherapy. I think they're a fascinating company, by the way. But yeah, just would like to hear your thoughts on, I guess it must be a risk that this company is taking without doing psychological support for a drug that's this powerful.
Yeah, I would like to qualify. And first, I shared your view that how could you go into or put someone into this amazing, mind-blowing experience without preparation? Well, it turns out that they explain to patients of what is coming.
Okay.
They debrief patients afterwards, so it's not as though they send them into a room, give them a bong, and let them take care of themselves.
Yeah.
There is the psychological support in the room, especially
Okay.
when you land, when you maybe have a few sentences to say what you just experienced. However, it is a very difficult beast to prepare someone to something that is completely overwhelming, meaning there is no discussion, there is no choice, especially if you take the highest dose, you will be gone. I mean, what else can you say, patient, as opposed to preparing for a psilocybin experience, which you will be there during the experience. You might even interact with the facilitator, and it's going to last 4 to 6 hours. And you might have peaks and valleys during that experience. You might feel extremely euphoric. You might face some very difficult issues from the past. So a more intensive preparation for this more interactive experience, especially with the facilitator, is probably more warranted as opposed to when you send someone to space. I mean, how can you explain that you'll feel 16 Gs? And what do you say about 16 Gs without putting the person through the experience? So, and the other thing that I'd like to add is that GH Research is probably in the far out in the spectrum in terms of the level of support, meaning minimal support. I think what they are trying to achieve here is to show that what is the effect, the drug effect on these conditions. No one is going to argue, including GH research, that additional psychotherapy afterwards could be beneficial. Every drug treatment is improved by additional therapy, whether it's structured therapy or a handful of sessions to integrate what just happened to me. And so they are not agnostic, or they are not ignorant, I should say,
Yeah,
that people could benefit from psychotherapy. But what they want to see is what the drug effect is.
I see. Okay, thank you so much. That was awesome to hear you explain that to us. So from here, I guess I'd like to move on now to the NN-DMT space specifically. But I mean, 5-MeO. Before we move on, I think that phase 2B results from GH research, I think they have potential to turn a lot of heads when those come out. I'm really looking forward to that. But okay, sorry. Anyway, now to NN-DMT.
Right.
There's a lot more competition, it seems, in this area of drug development when you're looking at the investment space, and a bunch of different delivery systems we're seeing. One thing I'm noticing, though, is that most of these companies are trying to extend the duration of DMT, it seems, to around 45 minutes. I guess what I'd like to ask you, considering you analyze these companies, what are you focusing in on here? Are you looking like what delivery systems are interesting to you? I guess some companies are using psychological support. I'm still trying to figure out if Atai is going full on digital therapeutics. Are they trying to replace a human therapist with Viridia Life Sciences, or is that technology to aid a therapist? Sorry, it's a loaded question, but yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this space.
Yeah, and just going backwards, maybe technology is going to aid and probably never replace a therapist, especially during a psilocybin trip or an MDMA experience when you open up about the previous trauma. There is no AI-driven, human-like being who could relate to that opening about something that is a very difficult topic to discuss. So in the first approximation, all of these digital tools are developed into with the highest purpose of monitoring patients, monitoring their activities after the dosing session, monitoring for potential relapse. I mean, with an iPhone, you can monitor a person's activity, looking at how much they sleep, how much they stay in bed, how much they move around on a daily basis, which could be a signal or a trigger for eventual retreatment.
Got it.
If
Okay.
it's necessary. So this is what we are going to see at first. And there is going to be, I am sure, some digital tools that will help us eventually to find the right patient for these therapies.
Yeah.
Not everyone responds. Not everyone goes into the remission. And the question is, you reset the brain of person A and person B. Person A is in remission. Person B is completely unfazed with the treatment. What is the difference between the two? Could we better select for likely responders? Going back to the DMT space, we talked a little bit about small pharma.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to insert into the question of expanding the duration something about the intellectual property. Obviously, DMT is a naturally occurring compound. 5-MeO DMT the same. Psilocybin is the same. And we have drugs such as LSD and MDMA, which has been synthesized decades ago. So there is no patent protection on the compound itself. What can be done, and this is not something new or unique to the psychedelic space, is to obtain secondary patents, which is around formulations, around chemical modifications of DMT, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a second, and or defining the dosing schedule, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the chemical modification of the drug, such as replacing hydrogen atoms with deuterium, is the strongest form of protection because you're creating a new chemical entity.
Yes.
Just happens to be that in the case of DMT, when you replace a handful of hydrogen atoms with deuterium, the half-life in the body gets longer. So the enzymes that break down this modified deuterated DMT, they'll have a tougher time to getting rid of the compound. So DMT can circulate for a longer period of time in the blood and in the brain. Therefore, the trip is extended. Now, what we don't know, and we're about to find out from Cybin and small pharma, if there is an additional clinical benefit if you put people not into a 15-minute experience, but a 45-minute experience. And there are some non-industrial interesting experiments ongoing or getting underway with DMTX. I don't know if you heard of it. When they want to continuously infuse DMT for hours and hours, and to see what is the impact from the safety and the efficacy perspective.
I actually had to piggyback on that question, actually, and it has to do with both small pharma and Cybin. So since both small pharma and Cybin are pursuing deuterated versions of DMT, can their IP strategies exist side by side without infringing on one another? Like, what does that look like?
That was my question as well, Adam, and it's a very valid one. So if you look at the chemical structure of DMT, there is probably about a dozen locations where you can replace the hydrogen with deuterium. Somehow, and I don't know how it happened in the background, they managed to obtain protection for chemical structures that are not overlapping. So the deuterated DMT developed by Cybin is deuterated at different locations than the DMT developed by small pharma. And both would agree, and I checked with both, that there is no infringement, no overlap between the two. Now, you would ask, so is this a gimmick? Which one would be preferred by patients, assuming that both gets to be approved? This is such a large market, unfortunately. Even if we look at the sickest of all, treatment-resistant depression, we have 4 million people in the US. So multiple companies, multiple approaches, let it be DMT, psilocybin, or LSD, will be able to coexist, and there will be preferences from one patient to another. There's going to be obviously a first mover advantage depending on who gets there first. Right now they seem ahead, but I'm not worried about it's not a zero-sum game, or there's no winner that takes all.
And it's interesting. I kind of found out actually recently, Cybin's actually looking at generalized anxiety disorder with their DMT program, which I found very interesting considering most of these companies are looking at TRD or MDD. I just have one more question left about the NN-DMT space, and then I'd like to ask one more, then I'll hand it to Adam. So small pharma, those results, I think all of us who are following the space were very impressed with those results. The stock shot up for like a day or two after those results came out. It was very short-lived. I think it was trading at all-time lows just a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we looking out for with small pharma from an investment perspective? Are they going to get bought out? Do they need to partner up? Because I saw their cash position was at I think 20 million. And I'm thinking to myself, is that enough to fund a large phase 2 trial with SPL028? They want to move on to their deuterated form.
Yeah,
Is that enough? Yeah.
Certainly not enough. They were able to do some headcount reduction, so they stretch out the existing cash, according to the latest communication, until the end of Q4 of 24. So this year and next year. However, that won't be sufficient to run a large phase 2B trial, and some of the smaller trials that they are thinking of and or conducting right now. So they definitely would need to raise additional capital. Why isn't the stock working? Why isn't any of these psychedelic stocks are working?
Yeah.
Because the biotech market is not working. If you look
Yeah.
at the index XBI, it hasn't followed the recent moves in the tech world. It's just catatonic for the
Yeah.
time being. This is the highest risk area in any technology. I mean, 90% of the drugs that you enter clinical trials with will fail.
Yes.
Only 10% will make it. Now, what is, I think, very unique about psychedelic medicine, that it has been tested for 50, 60, 70 years. So we know that it's not going to kill you.
Yes.
You dose it appropriately in the right setting. And safety is one of the biggest concern in drug development. Some drugs fail in the market. So they go through the phase 1, 2, 3 development, and there is a rare side effect that pops up in the first year after launch, and the drug is dead. So high risk area. However, my thesis is, and I just don't know the timing, there is going to be a rotation into these higher risk assets once the money has been made in the Microsofts, in the Netflix, in the Amazons of the world, because biotech is healthcare in general is in such a bad shape, especially mental health care, that we have so much work to do. We have so much investment to do to help, the 1 out of 4 Americans who suffer from these conditions. So it's an immense market. There will be a turning point. Now, the other thing which small pharma would have to figure out is to graduate to a U.S. exchange listed in Toronto, which prohibits some investors to go abroad and buy the stock on that exchange. So what would be also a catalyst if they could figure out, perhaps in conjunction with a financing, to move to a more senior exchange, more liquid exchange. And very big contrast between the two stocks, Small Pharma and Cybin. If you look at the value traded in Cybin stock, it's probably 20 to 30 times on a daily basis than in Small Pharma. So that explains why the response was temporary, and just are waiting for a continuation of some sort.
Definitely.
So,
thank you. Adam.
So my first question is, so what is your view on the current availability of capital for companies in the space?
It's scarce. We've seen that both ATI and Compass Pathways had to resort to a debt instrument. Cybin opted for a financing instrument that is optional. They have the ability to draw down over the next 2 years. So it's nothing like it was 2 years ago, when some of these companies raised money every 2-3 months and the stock went up every time after those raises. I'm thinking Mind Medicine, where you've seen that trajectory. So it's scarce. However, we see, if you, for example, look up the holders of G8 Research, that significant, very well-known biotech funds are invested in this space. And for now, they made very selective bets. But as we gain more clinical data, as we gain direction of or early results from, for example, from deuterated DMT from both Cybin and small pharma, not only investors, but uh, larger biotech companies may take notice, and or pharma companies, and may come in and change the landscape by making statements. For example, Mindset Pharma attracted some interest from a Japanese company for two of their new chemical entity molecules that are inspired by psychedelics. So that should lead to further interest. I would just add that there are some early signs here. Spravato, which is the inhaled version of ketamine,
Yes.
just recently reported that J&J reported their numbers, and the drug is pushing $600 million of revenue. So by next year, that's going to be a blockbuster, meaning over $1 billion. That's a compound, a drug that doesn't necessarily fit into the class because it's not a classic psychedelic drug, but it has the type of administration that is not trivial. You're not taking a pill at home, but you have to come into the treatment center for 2 hours for every administration. But it could be made into a blockbuster drug. So, what about DMT or 5-MeO DMT, which requires half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour from A to Z in a clinic? And it could be just as valuable, if not more, than Spravato.
Yes.
Yeah, and also just to add on that, Atai is currently working on that the sublingual film, the DMT sublingual film. So just
Adam,
sorry.
actually, sorry to interrupt. I had always thought it was also like on the tongue, that it went on the tongue. It turns out it's an oral transmucosal film, and I got this wrong in the past. So I guess they put it on the inside of the cheek. And Adam, I'm glad you brought this up because I'm sure a lot of the viewers know Atai is a large position for me. I really like the company and their diversity. Elemer, do you think that if Atai is successful, because I know they had to add a part 3, I'm thinking maybe they ran into issues, I don't know. If they're successful with this delivery method, do you see that scaling out way more than, let's say, IV intravenous DMT?
Yes. So absolutely. I mean, oral is preferred by anything that when it comes to needles or inhalation or intranasal, uh, something that you stick on your cheeks and it dissolves in 5 minutes and goes into the bloodstream immediately through the veins. There is probably preferable. The only thing that I would caution is that while there is a lot of sublingual, a lot of buccal drugs that are on the market, every chemical is a different beast, meaning you have to use different sort of excipients, which are molecules that would carry DMT or 5-MeO DMT across the membrane into the bloodstream. So how much of what you stick on the inside of the cheek gets into the bloodstream? That's the important question. So you mentioned that they had to go up one dose. That means that they probably already saw some effect. And it's very interesting because you can test it on healthy volunteers. I mean, if they don't see anything, they didn't get enough.
Yeah.
And if they are at some sort of a peak experience, it in healthy volunteers that we got the dose. So I think during the next quarter or two, they would be able to announce whether they are successful. Again, nothing is guaranteed.
Yes.
Although it seems simple, but you have to put enough drug onto that matrix, onto that film, and enough has to dissipate from that film into the bloodstream as opposed to going down the throat.
I
If
see.
it goes to the stomach, it gets chewed up. It has to be in the bloodstream. So that's the challenge that they are going to do, that they are facing. But they're working with a company that does this for a living. I think it's called Intelligenics.
Yes,
Yeah.
Adam's a big
I'm
fan.
actually a
of
huge fan of
IntelliGenX.
Intelligenics.
This man loves IntelliGenX.
So, oh, go
I
for it.
apologize, Adam. Just one question. I have to ask you this, Elemer, because I've been trying to find people to give me an answer on this, and no one has a clue. I don't know if you heard of the company Lusaris Therapeutics.
Yes.
So yeah, RA Capital, the guys who backed GH Research. I remember a couple months back they announced that Lusaris raised a $60 million Series A, and they were also looking at these films, but with 5-MeO DMT.
Right.
It's like they're gone now. Like, do you have any clue what happened? Did they run into? Is it possible that they ran into problems with this delivery method they were looking at?
That's a hypothesis that I currently have. Because here's what happened. I checked their website after someone alerted me about 2 months ago, and it was dead.
Yeah.
Then maybe a couple of weeks ago, I checked LinkedIn profiles for 6 people that previously associated themselves with Lusaris. 4 out of 6 is a past employee of Lusaris. I checked the website yesterday. It's still not working.
Yeah.
That trial that they started already in healthy volunteers when they announced the financing in November, it was already ongoing. And they were expecting results by mid 2023. We are in mid 2023. The trial was actually never registered on clinicaltrials.gov, which is okay. It could be done maybe in Belgium or in Australia, where they don't have to necessarily list the study. But the suspicion or the hypothesis is that they just couldn't get enough 5-MeO DMT in the film that would cross the membrane and get into the bloodstream in sufficient quantities. Hypothesis unconfirmed, but there are some signs indicating that that might be the case.
Wow. Okay, thank you. I had to ask you that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So do you think there is an already adequate clinic infrastructure in the US to roll out psychedelic assisted psychotherapy once it gains FDA approval and becomes commercialized? What about the expected availability of trained therapists?
Yes, it's never enough. The crisis is so large that before we are going to treat the vast majority of the patients suffering from mental health, we need to have a significant expansion of the infrastructure. Having said that, if you look at it from the company perspective, any of the companies that we discussed today, and let's use one example where we haven't talked extensively, but Compass Pathways, which is closer to the clinic or closer to approval, they say that by the time they finish with their clinical work, they're going to have 300 trained therapists. Their exposure is 4 to 6 hours. So let's just assume that every therapist, once the drug is approved, these highly trained ones, this 300, will treat a patient a day, Monday through Friday. If you do the math and you use a number of $10,000 to $15,000 per patient per treatment, drug cost, you get to $1 billion very easily. So and as we are witnessing, Spravato, which requires some training, which requires the patient to show up twice a week for 2 hours in the first month. That's 8 times in the first month. There is an existing infrastructure for Spravato to become $1 billion drug. There is the existing infrastructure for psilocybin to become $1 billion drug. With the minimal intervention that GH research is thinking about, meaning the patient comes in, you read the informed consent, what to expect, undergoes the treatment, and half an hour later walks out of the treatment, that's much even further scalable. So again, we are not going to solve during the next 5 to 10 years the crisis that we are facing when 1 out of 4 Americans would need some sort of a treatment like this. But on a company basis and on you know, we are going to make a dent with the existing infrastructure, but there are signs of the expanding numbers of ketamine clinics, the expanding number of TMS clinics where they apply transmagnetic stimulation to the brain. So it's going to grow with the market. I'm not afraid that we are going to have drugs on the market and no one can administer them.
Yeah. And, yeah, I know Greenbrook TMS, I think they have 130 clinics, and I read Compass's investor deck, and it looks like they want to use those clinics. It's not like I guess a psychedelic focused clinic, but they offer TMS therapy, esketamine. I'm personally, as an investor, I'm not too worried about the clinical infrastructure. I think it's going to be, for MDMA, I think that's a different story. I think you will need those kind of high-end clinics potentially, like the ones Numinous Wellness has, big rooms, the couch. And it seems that the psychotherapy aspect of MDMA is maybe even more important than what it is to these other classic psychedelics. But it's going to be interesting to see.
It's a very key distinction, Jack, if we have just a couple of more minutes. An MDMA session is very, very interactive between the patient and the therapist. In the drug, by its nature, it makes you open up and talk about your trauma. That practitioner, therapist, would have to channel you in the right direction, not to intervene, but to channel you in the right direction. And this goes on for 4 to 6 hours.
Yeah.
The MAPS protocol calls for 3 of these drug sessions and 3 therapy sessions interspersed between those sessions. So the therapy component is very onerous. And so when you think about a course of MDMA therapy until the patient goes into remission, as opposed to a course of 5-MeO DMT therapy, it's a huge difference.
Yes.
One is absolutely scalable. The other one needs some heavy lifting, some heavy expansion, training. MAPS dreams about 25,000 of these therapists after 5 years being on the market, but it's going to take a significant effort.
Yeah. I've had conversations with friends too, about the scalability of MDMA. I think a lot of people assume that once MDMA commercializes, it's going to be a blockbuster drug. I think it's going to take quite some time. But I'll just add a separate thing. I know Atai has an MDMA program, and they're looking at digital therapeutics. I wonder how much talk therapy they're going to have involved with that, because again, like you said, it's very interactive with MDMA and therapy. And it seems like with psilocybin, it's really, most of the time, at least, it's the preparatory session, the dosing session, then the integration session.
Right.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see how different companies are going about this in a different way. And so many, just fascinating.
Yeah, and this is a very important lesson, and I learned this over the last 3 years, that not every psychedelic drug created equal. Every single one of them requires a different sort of paradigm because they are treating different conditions. If you treat addiction, the therapy component, and you mentioned Beckley Psytech with their alcohol use disorder program, that needs to be followed with rigorous therapy because their chance of relapse is very, very high. You have to constantly remind people of what a significant achievement that you haven't been been drinking for the last 2 weeks, and you used to drink 30 drinks a day
Yeah.
before that. It's very different than rewiring the brain or resetting the brain when you have a mood disorder and you wake up and you feel good about yourself the next day.
Yeah.
So different diseases, different drugs, different paradigms, and different effort to scale those eventually.
Definitely.
Got you. So there are a lot of questions around the commercialization of psychedelic assisted therapy. Drug pricing is also notoriously non-transparent. Let's say, for example, COMP360 gains FDA approval and becomes insurance reimbursable. How will the economics be shared between the drug company and the clinic administering the therapy? Assuming the total treatment costs $20,000 American, how much would that go to Compass, and how much would that go to the clinic providing the service?
Yeah. So, good question. And I can tell you that if you ask this from 10 different persons, they might have 10 different answers. So let me give you mine. The drug price. So what Compass and pretty much all of these companies, maybe except MAPS, is trying to segregate the drug cost and the cost of the therapy. I'm sure you have seen the effort by MAPS and Compass to put in a reimbursement code, at least a temporary reimbursement code for the therapy session, so the administration of the drug. They are thinking about that the therapy that prepares the patient and the integration, which is 1 to 2 hours after the dosing session, will be covered under existing codes. So if you think about the two bookends, those are going to be covered by just submitting a reimbursement for the hour that the therapist took to prepare you. There is going to be a separate code for administering the drug, and it's at least based on the language in the code, it's very specific for if it takes an hour or if it takes 6 hours, that it's going to be a scalable code, so you'll get more paid more highly if you have to sit there for 6 hours. It will also distinguish between what is the professional background of the therapist, whether it's just a licensed practitioner, a PhD level psychiatrist, etc., etc. The long-winded answer is that the drug component, since in all of these experiments, including the GH research work and even the psilocybin work or the DMT work, pretty much will identify what the drug does. Therefore, the benefit due to the drug and the current treatment cost of a patient who is suffering from treatment-resistant depression is going to determine, depending on the clinical benefit, of how much they can charge, and then how much pushback they're going to get from payers, and then they'll settle on a number, and let's just call it $12,000 to $15,000 per year for the drug itself. Now you have, in the case of psilocybin, you probably have 6 to 8 hours therapist time, depending on the level of training. That could be anywhere between $100 to $300, and you do the math, and then you find what the therapist component is going to be. But it's not going to be a bundled payment given to Compass, who will take the money for the drug itself and then distribute it to the centers. But the therapist will ask for reimbursement separately from the drug company.
Okay, so in terms of, insurance reimbursement, I guess what Compass is going to have to do is show that their treatment is maybe as good or works better than esketamine right now for TRD. I assume that's going to be a big part of what they have to do. Now, I'm going to be honest here. When I saw the Compass Pathways phase 2B data, I thought, wow, for a single dose of a drug to have 20% of people in remission at the 3-month mark, that's pretty incredible. But I think I think people were expecting kind of like MAPS level MDMA assisted therapy, like 67% remission type results.
Yep.
Now, I know Compass is also going to be looking at 2 doses. They have an arm of the trial in phase 3 where they're going to be looking at 2 doses,
Yep.
which what's been historically used by these academic institutions like Johns Hopkins. Do you expect, and I know this is just speculation, would you expect that 2 doses would make a difference? I think with small pharma in their trial, 2 doses of DMT didn't necessarily make a difference, if I'm remembering correctly. So, yeah, sorry, again, another loaded question here, but
but it's reasonable. You know, so again, there is differences between psilocybin and DMT. If you get a sufficient dose of DMT, you are gone. There's no question about it. If you get a 25 milligram dose psilocybin, but you are not prepared, not 100% prepared to lose your ego during the next 4 to 6 hours, you can indeed resist. You can just get up and walk around and don't give a hoots about whatever is going on in your head, because you just don't want to let go. Because it's weird. It started to have these sounds and visuals. Is this healing? No, I don't think so. Let me just go out and do something else, read a book. With DMT, you cannot do that. You are in the maximal effect if you get the high enough dose. Therefore, I think, and I always thought, that a second dose would capture more people in terms of benefiting overall from the drug from a psilocybin treatment. So my hypothesis that we'll see a higher number than 24% in the phase 3 results with the 2 doses.
Yeah.
Furthermore, I would let you know that the bar is on the ground. There is no bar. There is no ketamine bar because the ketamine is a different sort of treatment modality. You have to come back twice a week for months, or for the first month. Then you have to retreat every week for up to 6 to 8 months until you fail to respond or you are in remission. Here, you have a treatment landscape when nothing works, meaning treatment-resistant depression. There is no options for these patients. And if you put, I'm just making this up, 40% into remission, and you provide some benefit to 60%, that's unheard of.
Wow.
So then the pharmacoeconomic benefit will be determined, is going to be based on how much time the patient needs to spend with the treatment, what is the benefit, what is the difference between treated and control. Because if you look at the ketamine results, for example, and you cited, minus 20 points on the MADRS, the control group declines at around 15 points as well. So the delta between the treated and placebo is that large. With 2 doses of psilocybin, I think the separation is going to be very much unheard of. So it's going to beat ketamine, not only based on convenience, but based on the effect size as well.
Wow, that was awesome to hear you explain it that way. I hadn't thought about it like that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you explain in layman's terms to our audience what is an active moiety and how does it play into a company's IP strategy, specifically in the psychedelic space?
So it's the chemical structure that is the business end of the molecule, meaning the one that will bind to that serotonin receptor in the brain. And there might be additional stuff in the tablet, like excipients to carry the molecule, which are usually inert, some polymers or something, but they don't actually have anything to do with the efficacy. They just help you to traffic the drug into the body and eventually into the bloodstream. So the active moiety is the one that is protected by a patent. So if this structure has been created, for example, by Mindset Pharma, or the deuteration by Cybin or Small Pharma, the active moiety, this deuterated DMT or MS1004, or whatever the code name for the new drug that Mindset came up with, that's the drug that is protected. That's the drug that is going to initiate the action in the brain at the receptor level.
Understood. So to piggyback on that, so what do you view as good IP protection versus weak IP protection? Which companies do you think have the strongest IP in the space, and why?
A new chemical entity, 15 to 20 years, and then they'll add some more years to it by applying for additional patents, is much stronger than a formulation patent.
Yeah.
Because the formulation patent you can engineer around and have a different formulation, and you could still get approval for the same indication. If you have a chemical entity that is novel, that is protected, no one can come to the market until your patent expires.
So with a new formulation, if a company wants to come up with a new formulation, I would assume they would still have to run clinical trials with that new formulation, though, still, right?
Absolutely. So, it will, how challenging the situation is going to be is how successful the drug is. If the drug is only a $50 million drug, and you would have to spend $200 million to run the clinical trials to come up with a knockoff, then you don't do it. If it's a $2 billion drug and it's worth the effort, then you go and compete. And there is plenty of companies with these formulation capabilities that can help you out.
Understood. Sorry, continue.
That's okay. That was it.
All right. So, what are your opinions around Compass Pathways, Polymorph A, Comp360's Polymorph A, as a distinguishing factor from generic synthetic psilocybin? Given this IP has been challenged several times and brings a fair amount of controversy.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is a good thing for a patent, because every single challenge and rebuttal of that challenge strengthens the patent itself. So the polymorph patents are actually valid. They are the crystal forms that you find when you synthesize a drug. So it's when the active ingredient gets stacked up next to each other and forms these little crystals that you could see under the microscope as like a salt crystal or a sugar crystal. And so that polymorph, that version of the crystal, can actually be patented. I recently had a conversation with a big pharma company called Lundbeck. They have an antidepressant on the market for the last 20 years. They extended their runway, their IP runway, because they had a polymorph protection patent filed, which will give them an additional 7 years of protection. So they are strong. The only weakness in a polymorph patent is that if you come up with a different polymorph that is not covered by the original patent, very similar to if you come up with a different formulation or a different route of administration and you patent that, then it's challengeable. And then what comes into the picture, for example, if someone invents an alternative polymorph form of psilocybin, then the two parties talk, and there's a licensing agreement, and they pay royalties for the patent holder who may have that additional patent, whether it's a university or a company, and they agree to coexist and share the economics.
Understood. That was a great response. So we asked this question pretty frequently to guests on the show. I like to hear different takes on it. An ongoing debate in the psychedelic community is around the actual need for a psychedelic experience to achieve a therapeutic outcome. As I'm sure you're well aware, there are companies trying to develop so-called psychedelic-inspired non-psychedelic drugs that can increase neuroplasticity, etc., without the trip. In your opinion, how necessary is the actual trip, and do you think this new class of drugs without the trip will ultimately be successful? And if you could talk about the pyramid approach that you've mentioned before.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know what you're referring about the pyramid approach. I'd like to, if you could clarify that a little bit.
So I think I've heard you talk about before how people can be started off on NCEs, and that can be like the first kind of.
Yeah. So the jury is out. However, the answer will probably depend on the indication.
Yes.
So, for example, if you have a condition that requires a major reset, meaning you are so addicted to a drug that you cannot be sober, not even for a minute a day, you constantly have to feed that addiction, that is going to require a major shakeup. As opposed to you suffer from major depression, Zoloft didn't work, you're able to perform your daily duties, you're sad, and you can be excited about certain things, where a little bit of a shake up, a little bit of rearrangement with what they call it, these psychoplastogens, that doesn't necessarily lead to a psychedelic experience, may be sufficient. I would also, and I talked to some of the founders of those companies, such as Delix,
Yeah.
they are not out there to take the fun out of fungi. I'm sure you've seen title, not my quote. They are there where, in certain cases, people cannot undergo a psychedelic experience, such as schizophrenia or
Yeah.
bipolar depression, especially in the manic phase. They are there potentially when you gave the patient a major jolt and then you try to maintain them in that plastic environment when they can readjust their condition. So they are periodically receiving for 6 months or however many, however long period, these follow-up drugs that doesn't cause hallucinations or do not lead to. It's almost like macrodosing followed up by microdosing. You can think of this as this paradigm. So there is no yes and no, or there is no trivial answer that absolutely we need the psychedelic experience, or not at all. Neuroplasticity will take care of it.
Yeah. Well said.
Understood.
And I've been thinking recently about this. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I know microdosing and these non-hallucinogenic psychoplastogens are not exactly the same, but I'm looking forward to this LSD microdosing data for ADHD. I know Diamond Therapeutics is looking at psilocybin microdosing, I believe, for anxiety disorder. I could be wrong.
Yeah,
So I'm interested to see what low doses do first, actually. But back to what I was going to originally say. So with ketamine, it's an NMDA antagonist. It seems like this company, Axum Therapeutics, was able to create an NMDA antagonist drug that can be taken at home. So my thinking is, if scientists are able to do that for the NMDA receptor, what's going to stop them from doing this to the 5-HT2A receptor? And I'm sure they work very differently, but at least that's my thinking. And I agree with you, Elemer. I don't think it's going to completely, if it works, I don't think it's going to completely replace these hallucinogenic drugs. But yeah, just my thoughts on this stuff. I'm not. Yeah.
We'll know it soon enough because Delix is already in the clinic.
Yeah.
In phase 1 trial, so we'll know. And it, you know what it will be probably. It's probably going to be dose dependent. So You probably remember that ATI is working with orketamine.
Yes.
And their orketamine study wasn't significantly different.
Yeah.
They wanted to use an absolutely non-psychedelic dose.
Yes.
They wanted to develop that for the at-home market. I bet you if they push the dose higher, they will start seeing a bigger separation. But the question is, where is the magic threshold when you give someone a drug that leads to marginal hallucinations? If there is no safe band between hallucinogenic and non-hallucinogenic dose. So
Yeah.
it is going to be, once you load up the brain with enough of these drugs that trigger the 5-HT2A receptor, you'll start having some psychedelic effects.
Yeah. Well, this is where things get really interesting. And as an investor, I am interested in non-hallucinogenic. When those companies, if they go public, I think I will probably buy into that a little bit. I know Mindset Pharma is working on non-hallucinogenic. They're way behind Delix. But what's really interesting to me with this non-hallucinogenic drug development, I've read articles that Delix is looking at like a once a month type of pill, which is just incredible. And then on the other side, you have, Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals. I think I listened to Jonathan Sporn in an interview. They're looking at more the microdosing paradigm, but they're claiming that what they're trying to do is no matter how much you take of that, you won't have any hallucinogenic effects. So like when being an investor looking at the non-hallucinogenic drug development side of things, especially, someone like me without a scientific background, it's just interesting to see how so many companies are looking at this now. Like, how do you, as an investor, differentiate with what each company's doing in this space?
Yeah, very difficult. Think about how you differentiate between Cybin and small pharma. Not that easy. Same molecular entity, different pattern of iteration. But I think eventually clinical data will trump everything.
Okay.
You need to have a safe dose in the case of Delix that is non-hallucinogenic. And you have to show some impact, whether it's on a sustained basis or a follow-up to some more dramatic intervention, or giving it to patients who are mildly symptomatic. Maybe they are on an SSRI, and to boost the efficacy of an SSRI with a psychoplastogen.
Yeah.
But clinical data will tell us, because I have to tell you that there are so many anxiety drugs out there with such bad side effect profiles, and they're minimally better than placebo, meaning they are garbage. They are completely useless in most patients.
Wow.
So you have to see the type of effect that you see with the small pharma drug, or eventually with psilocybin from Compass, for any of these approaches to be different than what we tried during the last 40 years. Zoloft was approved in 1991, and we don't have anything better than Zoloft so far, or much better.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very well said. And I want to thank Dr. Elemer Piros for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to say anything.
Elemer, can I leave you just with one last question before we let you go? Again, thank you so much. This has been extremely informative, and I think our viewers are going to be very excited to watch this one. So before you go, valuing these companies, and, when I first invested in this space, I wasn't looking at valuations. I was saying, okay, this is what they're doing. It sounds good. I'm investing. But I learned over time, just because it's a good company doesn't mean you're buying it at the right price.
Right. Yeah.
Which was, a big learning thing for me. So I know with the price targets you give and you do, I'm sure I can't even imagine the amount of research you do for these price targets. So I've been made aware that you use the DCF model, discounted cash flow. if possible, in simple terms, can you explain how you go about that?
Yeah. So it's nothing new, nothing specific to the pharma world, but there are some elements to it which is really applicable for any drug.
Okay.
And it takes into account how long of a runway we have, meaning how long the patent protection is, what stage of development are we in, because every stage is associated with a different risk profile. Give you an example. Once you have phase 3 data available to you, there's a 90% chance of success, especially if there is statistical significance.
Yeah.
Once you have safety data and nothing else, you still have a 10% chance to succeed. And when you're in phase 2, you're somewhere in between with the probabilities, depending on how strong the data is. Okay. So market size, the length of the runway, and the probability of ever getting to those cash flows in 2027, 28, 29, etc., will determine the formula. So there is obviously variability in there because you have a range of pricing that you assume. Things are not going to go as they typically go in terms of timing of when they get there. There's delays. And there is going to be maybe competition that pops up. So if you assumed a 40% market penetration in 5 years after launch, but if you see like half a dozen companies come in with successful data, you may have to lower that 40% to 20% or 10%. So it's a constantly evolving something. The number is almost fictional. We have to call it a number. We cannot call it a range, but it's really a range.
Yeah.
Because of the variability of these assumptions. And it's changing, like my numbers on small pharma had to change once they released 6 months data, and with a 40% remission rate. That's a significant risk reduction because we didn't know anything about DMT. I mean, we had anecdotal evidence, but the small pharma is the first company that showed us in a controlled trial that there is a good likelihood that it's going to be a good drug for treatment for major depression.
And
we had zero information.
And when assuming or trying to take a good guess of how much revenue a drug could bring in, are you taking into consideration that scalability could be a problem, or are you comparing it to just drugs in the CNS space in general?
No, I mean, for example, when I walked you through the patient numbers or the therapist numbers vis-a-vis Compass pathways,
yes,
you cannot assume $10 billion revenue in the first year if you know that the therapist numbers are limited.
Got it.
Or if I were to do a DCF on MDMA, that rollout is going to be much, much slower before we get to maybe $500 million in 10 years. So all of these curves, if you could just picture, revenue growth and market penetration, are going to be different. And, you definitely have to be cognizant of what the market reality is, how involved the therapy, like 5-MeO DMT doesn't require a PhD level preparation or specialists to be there eventually when they get to the market. So all of this comes into the picture when you determine each of these NPV calculations.
I see. And thank you so much for coming on. This was, again, I'll say it again, just so informative. And thank you. Adam, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. We hope to have you on again soon. We can touch base in regards to the psychedelic sector at large every once in a while. If you'd like to say anything to the audience, feel free. But other than that, I'm good.
Thank you for the opportunity. what changed my mind to come back and focus on psychiatry is Michael Pollan's book. So, as most of you have probably read the book or seen the Netflix show, that's a transformative experience. So,
thanks to everyone who stuck around for the whole episode. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, please drop a like and subscribe so you get more notifications in regards to whenever we put up new content. And it also helps in promoting our content in the search algorithm on YouTube. So we'll really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next episode.